Who is leading the EOS Network Ventures?
The ENV does not currently exist. And so there is no legal entity that is the ENV. There is nobody in the ENV because the thing doesn't exist yet. What we have right now is a concept, it's an idea, and it's now the backing of the network to continue working towards creating this thing and actually operationalizing this thing. As I mentioned before with the role of the ENF, the network determines through the current consensus mechanism, which are represented by the block producers, the network determines where the ultimate, let's say, North Star is for the network, where the network should be heading. And the network months ago basically gave the ENF a challenge to try to fill this gap that I just explained beforehand. So the first time that we talked about ENV at the time was called ENF Ventures. We deployed the concept of ENF Ventures in the roadmap Q4 2021, which released on January 25th of this year. So roughly 10, 11 months ago or so. And that idea morphed over time. And this concept of what ENF Ventures, which ultimately became the ENV, is now, let's say if prior to putting the ENF Ventures on that roadmap, it was a spark, it was an idea, let's say that is draft one. What you saw in terms of the MSIG proposal is, let's say, draft 34 at a place, and I'm just making up this number, so don't take the number itself, just to give an idea what the idea has been discussed back and forth over that period of time, multiple times in this fireside chat. The funding mechanisms have been discussed in particular, for example, in Yield plus Blue paper, but the general overall packaged information couldn't come to be until the MSIG was created. That is the way that the EOS network essentially comes to consensus and gives a formal yay or nay. That is the mechanism by which the network says, please continue or not. That is what occurred last week with that MSIG. But this idea of the ENV, and formerly known as ENF Ventures, has been in the works back and forth, accumulating feedback, figuring out how this come to be and such. Over the last 11 months or so, up until a point where there was enough information that met the thresholds for this to be presented as an MSIG for the network to essentially say, please continue down this path. And the network has issued tokens. And so we can get into that later on as well, as like why that specific amount and such. But the network essentially, it's that chicken or the egg situation. And we were in this situation multiple times in the past. So I'll give it a little bit of context there as well. When I was a BP in the first early years, a lot of the BPs and a lot of community members would spend a lot of time drafting up proposals. And they would do so in silo and they wouldn't reach out to the block producers. And ultimately, when they'd reach out to the block producers, because at the end of the day, that is the consensus mechanism that needs to allow for either protocol level changes and or governance changes such as this, which this, I guess, is both. But anyways, they wouldn't reach out until they had spent a lot of time drafting a proposal. 6 months in, you've deployed a lot of capital, a lot of resource into presenting something. And ultimately, that's really only when the feedback can begin, because they weren't even in the loop beforehand. So that how can they give feedback? So that's a little bit of background there. But the other thing about, let's say, how this comes about, or the MSIG itself, the MSIG is the formal mechanism for the network in this particular instance to say, please keep going ahead. Where you are at in your drafting process is good enough for us to make a step. And what I was saying in terms of comparison to the ENF and how the ENF came about, it was very similar. When the ENF was launched, or when that first MSIG occurred where 3.5, give or take, EOS was transferred over from legacy name and RAM fees into an account and made available to the ENF, the ENF as an entity didn't exist. The next day, nothing happened. Basically, the next day was the validation from the network to say, please proceed down this path. Now figure out how to make this happen. Like, now you've got our commitment. Now you've got us making a formal, very public and transparent, I guess, support of this idea alongside with tokens. Now you can keep going and you can go ahead and actually figure out how to make this work. And this is really, in terms of comparison to the ENF, this is also what's very similar, is that the beginning of, I guess it's not like it's the beginning of the work, but draft 35 can start yesterday type of thing. So there's still a lot of uncertain answer, but now the network has reached its threshold in order to let this idea continue maturing. And realistically, it will take months before this thing actually, if the goal is, or if what people are asking for is, when will funds be deployed? Ultimately, when will investments be made and such? It's going to take months. It's going to take a few months before the structure is completely laid out, before funds can actually start being deployed, before term sheets are written, et cetera, et cetera. It will take time. But none of that could have happened before the network actually reaches consensus. And that's the chicken or the egg that's similar to when the ENF was launched.